The worst moment of my life started with the sound of people laughing. Not the warm kind of laughter you hear at weddings when someone tells a good story, but the sharp kind, the kind that cuts through a room and lets you know you are the reason for it. I remember standing in the center of the ballroom at the Grand Harbor Hotel in downtown Chicago, the crystal chandeliers glowing above me, my hands trembling slightly around a glass of sparkling water I hadn't taken a sip from in 10 minutes. I had spent 3 hours getting ready for that night, smoothing my navy blue dress, fixing my hair, telling myself that tonight was supposed to be the beginning of the rest of my life. Daniel Brooks had promised it would be special. My fiancé, the man I thought I was going to marry. Instead, he stood on the small stage near the dance floor with a microphone in his hand and a smile on his face that I suddenly realized I didn't recognize at all. "Everyone," he said, raising his glass as if he were making a toast, "I want to thank you all for coming tonight." The guests around us, friends, co-workers, distant relatives, turned their attention toward him with polite curiosity. I felt my stomach tighten with confusion. This wasn't part of the plan. We were supposed to announce the wedding date, maybe share a toast, maybe dance. That was what he told me. Daniel glanced toward me, and for a split second I thought I saw hesitation in his eyes. Then it disappeared. "But before we celebrate anything," he continued, "there's something I should probably say." A few people chuckled softly, expecting a joke. I forced a smile, hoping he was just being dramatic the way he sometimes liked to be at parties. The ballroom smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. Somewhere behind me a server walked by carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Then Daniel's voice changed. Colder. Louder. "Turns out," he said into the microphone, "when you plan to marry someone, it helps if they actually love you for the right reasons." A murmur moved through the crowd like a ripple across water. My heart started beating faster. "Daniel," I whispered under my breath, hoping he would stop, hoping this was some strange misunderstanding. But he kept going. "Emily Carter," he said, speaking my full name now, "has been very patient these last 2 years. Patient enough to wait for the ring. Patient enough to wait for the apartment. Patient enough to wait for everything that comes with marrying a successful guy." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed from the back of the room. My fingers tightened around the glass. I felt heat rush to my face. "But patience," Daniel said, lifting his hand slowly, "doesn't always mean love." And then he did something I will never forget. He slid the engagement ring off his finger where he had been holding it for the announcement, held it up so the diamonds caught the light from the chandeliers, and let it drop onto the polished marble floor. The small metallic sound echoed through the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye turned toward me. I stared at the ring on the floor between us, my chest tight, my thoughts spinning, and in that endless, humiliating silence, I realized that the life I thought I was about to begin had just shattered in front of everyone. I did not move. I could not. The ring lay on the marble floor between Daniel and me, catching the chandelier light like it was mocking me, and for a moment the entire ballroom felt impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every heartbeat sound too loud. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, some curious, some sympathetic, some entertained. Daniel folded his arms as if he had just finished telling a clever joke at a dinner party instead of dismantling our engagement in front of 80 guests. "Go ahead," he said lightly, his voice carrying across the room without the microphone now. "Pick it up if you want it so badly." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the back whispered something I could not quite hear. I stared at the ring for what felt like an entire minute, even though it could not have been more than 5 seconds. My mind was running through every possible reaction I could have. Walk away, cry, yell, laugh like none of it mattered. None of those options seemed possible while standing there under the soft golden lights of the ballroom with my entire life suddenly exposed like a stage performance. Finally, I forced myself to breathe in slowly. The air smelled like expensive cologne and white roses. My shoes clicked softly against the marble as I took a step forward. Then another. I bent down, my fingers hovering inches above the ring, and I heard the quiet sound of someone's phone camera activating somewhere in the crowd. Of course they were recording. In a city like Chicago, a dramatic moment at a high-end engagement party was practically entertainment. I felt the heat of embarrassment rise up my neck, but I kept my hand steady. I was not going to give Daniel the satisfaction of watching me break apart. Just as my fingers were about to touch the ring, another hand entered my field of vision. Large. Calm. Completely steady. The hand picked up the ring before I could. For a second, I thought it was Daniel trying to continue his performance, but when I straightened up, the man standing beside me was someone I had never seen before. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that looked like it had been made specifically for him. Dark hair swept back neatly, sharp features, and eyes that held a quiet focus that made the noise of the ballroom seem distant. He did not rush. He did not smile. He simply examined the ring between his fingers for a brief moment, like a jeweler inspecting a piece of work. Around us, the whispers began immediately. People shifted. Chairs scraped lightly across the floor. Daniel frowned, clearly annoyed that someone had stepped into the middle of his scene. "Excuse me," Daniel said, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before. "That does not belong to you." The man did not answer right away. Instead, he lifted his gaze toward Daniel with the kind of calm expression that made the air feel suddenly heavier. It was not anger. It was not aggression. It was something quieter and far more controlled. Then he turned slightly toward me. Up close, I could see faint silver at his temples and the subtle confidence in the way he carried himself, like someone who had never needed to raise his voice in order to be heard. "Emily Carter," he said softly, pronouncing my name with perfect clarity. My breath caught. I had never met him before. I was certain of it. Yet he knew exactly who I was. I blinked in confusion. "Yes," I managed. Quietly. Across the room, someone gasped under their breath. Another whisper moved through the crowd, this one louder. A name floated across the ballroom like a sudden gust of wind. Romano. Lucas Romano. I did not know much about Chicago's underground business world, but even I had heard that name before. The man still holding the ring glanced down at it once more, then back at me, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm enough that only the people closest to us could hear the words clearly. "It is a beautiful ring," he said. Then he extended his hand slightly toward me, the diamond glinting between his fingers, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. I did not reach for the ring. Not immediately. My eyes stayed on Lucas Romano's hand, as if the small diamond between his fingers had suddenly become the center of gravity in the room. Around us, the ballroom had shifted from uncomfortable curiosity into something else entirely. Tension. The kind that makes people forget to breathe. I could hear whispers traveling from table to table, like wind moving across water. Romano. That name carried weight, even for people who had never met him before. Daniel's confident expression faltered for the first time that night. He straightened his jacket and forced a small laugh that sounded far less convincing than before. "Listen," he said, raising his hand slightly like he was trying to control the situation again. "Whoever you are, this is a private event." Lucas Romano did not even glance at him. His attention remained on me, steady and calm, like he had already decided that Daniel was no longer relevant to the conversation. That alone made the room feel different. Power does not always arrive with loud words. Sometimes it simply stands still and lets the world rearrange itself around it. I finally found my voice. "You know my name," I said quietly, my heart still beating far too fast. "But I do not know yours." For a brief moment, something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, more like recognition. "Lucas Romano," he said simply. The name landed in my chest like a dropped stone. I had heard that name in passing conversations, in business articles, even in quiet warnings from friends who followed the city's politics more closely than I did. Lucas Romano owned companies, buildings, shipping routes, and according to rumor, far more influence than any single person should reasonably have. And now he was standing less than 2 feet away from me in the middle of what was supposed to be my engagement party. Daniel cleared his throat loudly. "That ring," he said, gesturing toward Lucas's hand, "was mine." Lucas finally turned his head slightly in Daniel's direction. It was not an aggressive movement. It was slower than that. Measured. The kind of look a teacher might give a student who had spoken out of turn. Lucas repeated calmly, as if he were testing the word for accuracy. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lucas lifted the ring again, letting the diamond catch the chandelier light above us. The reflection scattered small fragments of white light across the polished floor. Then he looked back at me. "Emily," he said quietly, speaking my name again as if he had known it for years instead of seconds. "May I see your hand?" My instinct told me to refuse. My instinct also told me that nothing about the moment unfolding around us was ordinary anymore. The entire ballroom had gone silent. Even the musicians who had been playing soft jazz in the corner had stopped. 80 people watching one decision. Slowly, almost without realizing I had made the choice, I lifted my left hand. My fingers were trembling slightly. Lucas noticed. Instead of commenting on it, he simply stepped half a pace closer. Close enough that I could smell the faint scent of cedar and clean fabric from his suit. His movements were careful, respectful, not rushed, as if the entire room could wait as long as necessary. "You dropped something important," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only I could hear the next words clearly. "And I do not like seeing someone humiliated in a room that should know better." Then, before anyone could interrupt or question what was happening, Lucas Romano gently took my hand and slid the ring onto my finger. The diamond settled against my skin like it had always belonged there. A sharp wave of murmurs rolled through the ballroom immediately. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered something urgently into another guest's ear. Daniel stared at my hand as if he had just witnessed something. Impossible. Lucas released my fingers slowly and turned toward the crowd, his posture relaxed, his voice calm, but clear enough for the entire room to hear without a microphone. "There," he said. "That looks much better." For a moment no one spoke. The silence inside the ballroom felt thick enough to touch, like the entire room had forgotten how to react. My eyes stayed fixed on the ring, now resting on my finger. The diamond was small but bright, reflecting the golden chandelier light above us in tiny flashes that made my heart beat even faster. I could still feel the warmth of Lucas Romano's hand where he had held mine only seconds earlier. Across from us, Daniel stared as if someone had just rewritten reality in front of him. His mouth opened slightly before he finally managed to speak. "You cannot just do that," he said, his voice sharper now, louder than before, trying to reclaim the control he had clearly lost. "That ring does not belong to you." Lucas turned his head slowly toward him. The movement was calm, almost casual, but something in the room shifted immediately when he did. The whispers stopped again. People who had been leaning toward each other to exchange quiet comments suddenly straightened in their seats. Lucas did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply looked at Daniel with the same composed expression he had worn since the moment he picked up the ring from the floor. "You dropped it," Lucas said calmly. The words were simple, clear, impossible to argue with. A quiet ripple of nervous laughter moved through part of the crowd before quickly fading again. Daniel's face reddened slightly, the confidence he had displayed earlier beginning to crack under the weight of 80 witnesses watching the situation unfold. "That does not mean you get to put it on her finger," Daniel replied, gesturing toward my hand as if the ring itself had betrayed him. Lucas glanced briefly at my hand again, studying the ring as though he were considering the point seriously. Then he looked back at Daniel. "If a man throws away something valuable in front of a room full of people," he said evenly, "he should not be surprised when someone else decides it deserves better." A few guests gasped softly. Someone near the back muttered something under their breath that sounded suspiciously like approval. Daniel shifted his weight uncomfortably, clearly aware that the room was no longer on his side. "This is ridiculous," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "Emily knows this is ridiculous." He turned toward me now, searching my face for support. Tell him this is not real." For a moment I could not answer. My mind was still racing, trying to catch up with the last 2 minutes of my life. I had arrived at the Grand Harbor Hotel expecting to celebrate my engagement. Instead, I was standing in front of dozens of guests with a new ring on my finger placed there by a man I had met less than 1 minute earlier. Yet somehow, strangely, the humiliation that had been suffocating me only moments ago had faded. Lucas Romano had not raised his voice. He had not insulted anyone. He had simply stepped into the moment and changed it. I looked down at the diamond again, then slowly lifted my eyes toward Daniel. "You said I did not deserve it," I said quietly. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "You threw it on the floor." Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Lucas remained beside me, silent now, allowing me to speak for myself. That detail did not go unnoticed. "Maybe," I continued slowly, "you should not be surprised that someone else thought differently." A murmur swept across the ballroom again, louder this time. Daniel's jaw tightened as he realized the balance of the room had shifted completely. Lucas straightened his jacket slightly and glanced around the ballroom once more, his expression calm and controlled as if none of this chaos had anything to do with him. Then he looked down at the ring on my finger one more time and spoke in a quiet voice meant only for me. A ring should never be thrown away like that, he said. Not when someone else is willing to wear it with dignity. The murmurs in the ballroom grew louder, spreading from table to table like a slow rolling wave. I could feel the shift in the room even without looking up. 10 minutes earlier, those same people had been watching me with polite curiosity, waiting to see how the humiliation would end. Now they were watching something entirely different unfold. My fingers curled slightly as I became more aware of the ring on my hand. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of the diamond, but because of what the entire room now believed it meant. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to regain control of the situation he had created. "This is insane," he said again, louder this time, glancing around the room as if hoping someone else would step in and restore the version of events he preferred. "You all saw what happened. This is my engagement party." Lucas Romano did not react to the rising frustration in Daniel's voice. Instead, he reached for a glass of water from a nearby passing server and took a slow sip, as if the entire ballroom had simply paused for a brief intermission. The casualness of that small action seemed to unsettle Daniel even more. "Mr. Romano," Daniel said sharply, now clearly aware of exactly who he was dealing with. "With all due respect, you cannot just walk into someone else's event and start rewriting it." Lucas lowered the glass and set it carefully on the nearest table. Only then did he turn his full attention back to Daniel. "I did not rewrite anything," he said calmly. "You made your decision when you threw the ring on the floor." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated when several guests nearby nodded slightly at Lucas's words. The subtle shift of public opinion was impossible to ignore. I realized then that Daniel had made one critical mistake earlier in the evening. He had expected the room to laugh with him. Instead, the room was beginning to judge him. "Emily," Daniel said suddenly, turning toward me again, his tone changing into something more controlled. "You do not actually believe this nonsense, do you? You cannot seriously think this stranger has any right to put that ring on your finger." I looked at Daniel for a long moment. 2 years of memories flashed through my mind in the space of a few seconds. The dinners, the plans, the conversations about the future, and then the sound of the ring hitting the marble floor. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet but clear. "You made it very clear tonight that it was no longer yours." A few people near the front tables shifted in their seats. Someone softly exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for that exact answer. Daniel's expression hardened. "This is not over," he muttered. Lucas stepped slightly closer beside me then, not in a threatening way, simply closing the small distance between us as if the decision had already been settled. "You are correct," Lucas said calmly, addressing Daniel with the same composed tone he had used all evening. "It is not over." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Lucas adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket with slow precision before answering. "It means that when a man publicly discards something valuable, he should expect the world to notice who chooses to pick it up." The room fell silent again. Lucas glanced briefly toward the crowd of watching guests before returning his attention to me. For the first time that evening, his expression softened slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice perhaps, but enough for me to see the difference. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only I could clearly hear the next words. "If you would like to leave this room, I would be happy to walk you out." I looked around the ballroom then, at the guests who had come expecting celebration, at Daniel standing rigid and frustrated near the stage, at the dozens of curious eyes watching every movement. And then I looked down at the ring again. The diamond caught the chandelier light and flashed once more. For the first time since the evening had begun, I felt something different than humiliation. I felt control returning to my hands. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked at Lucas Romano. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think I would like that." I did not look back as we walked toward the ballroom exit. I expected whispers, and they came immediately, a low current of voices rising behind us like the echo of a storm we had just stepped out of. The marble floor felt colder under my shoes as the distance between us and the center of the room slowly grew. Lucas Romano walked beside me without rushing, his pace steady and controlled, as if dramatic exits from crowded ballrooms were something he did every day. A few guests instinctively stepped aside as we passed. Some lowered their voices. Others simply watched with wide eyes, clearly aware that whatever story they had expected to tell after tonight had just changed. The heavy glass doors leading to the hallway stood only 20 feet away when Daniel's voice cut across the room behind us. Emily. I stopped for a second. Not because I wanted to, but because hearing my name like that still triggered the instinct to respond. Lucas noticed immediately. He did not grab my arm or try to pull me forward. Instead, he simply paused beside me and waited. That small detail did not go unnoticed. Daniel's footsteps approached across the marble floor, quicker now, less controlled than before. When I finally turned around, he was standing about 10 feet away, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. The room had grown quiet again, as if the audience had decided the story was not over yet. You cannot seriously walk out with him, Daniel said. His voice was lower this time, but the tension inside it was impossible to miss. You do not even know him. Lucas glanced briefly at me, clearly leaving the response to me if I wanted to give one. For the first time that evening, I realized I was no longer standing in the middle of the room alone. I took a slow breath before answering. I knew you, I said quietly. The words seemed to land harder than anything else I could have said. Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting that reply. That is different, he insisted quickly. We had history. We had plans. I looked down briefly at the ring on my finger before raising my eyes again. You had plans, I corrected calmly. Tonight made it very clear what those plans actually were. A few guests near the front tables exchanged glances. Someone quietly cleared their throat. Daniel ran both hands through his hair now, frustration finally overtaking the confidence he had displayed earlier. Emily, this is ridiculous, he said again, but the certainty was gone from his voice. You are going to regret this tomorrow. Lucas finally spoke then, his voice calm enough that the entire room had to lean slightly closer to hear him. Regret usually comes from staying in the wrong place, he said. Daniel turned toward him sharply. And you think you are the right place? Lucas held his gaze for a moment before answering. I think she deserves the chance to leave a room where she was treated poorly. The statement was simple. No drama. No raised voice. Yet the quiet confidence behind it made several people in the room nod almost instinctively. Daniel looked around at the watching guests and seemed to realize that whatever control he thought he had earlier was completely gone. He exhaled sharply and shook his head. This whole thing is insane, he muttered. I turned back toward the exit then, no longer interested in continuing the argument. The hallway beyond the glass doors was quiet, the golden lights softer than the bright chandeliers behind us. Lucas opened the door for me without saying a word. As we stepped into the hallway, the noise of the ballroom faded instantly, leaving only the quiet hum of the hotel air system and the distant sound of traffic somewhere outside on Michigan Avenue. For the first time all evening, the silence felt peaceful instead of suffocating. I let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding and looked down again at the ring on my finger. Then I glanced up at Lucas Romano standing beside me in the quiet hallway. You realize, I said slowly, that everyone in that room now thinks we are engaged. Lucas looked at the ring for a moment before meeting my eyes again. His expression remained calm, but there was something thoughtful behind it now. Yes, he said simply. Then after a brief pause he added quietly, that was the point. I stood there for a moment in the quiet hallway, still trying to process the last 15 minutes of my life. Inside the ballroom, the muffled sound of voices continued, the party slowly recovering from the shock we had left behind. The thick hotel carpet beneath my shoes felt softer than the marble floor inside, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers from the lobby arrangements downstairs. Lucas Romano stood beside me with the same calm composure he had carried the entire evening, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I studied him more carefully now that we were alone. Up close he looked exactly like someone who was used to rooms changing when he entered them. Tall, confident, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. Yet there was nothing arrogant in the way he held himself. Just certainty. I looked down again at the ring on my finger. The diamond reflected the hallway lights in small flashes every time I moved my hand. You said, that was the point, I repeated slowly, lifting my eyes back to him. But you still have not explained why. Lucas leaned slightly against the wall beside the door, his posture relaxed. For a few seconds he did not answer, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he glanced briefly toward the ballroom doors behind us before returning his attention to me. Because humiliation should not be the last chapter of a story, he said calmly. His voice was quiet but steady, the same tone he had used all evening. And tonight you were about to walk out of that room believing you deserved what happened. I blinked in surprise. You do not even know me. Lucas shook his head slightly. I know enough, he replied. I know that a room full of people watched someone try to embarrass you. I also know that no one in that room stepped forward to stop it. The words settled in my chest heavier than I expected. I thought back to the moment Daniel had dropped the ring. The silence. The laughter. The phones recording the scene. Lucas continued speaking before I could respond. Sometimes, he said, people forget that public cruelty has consequences. I crossed my arms lightly, still trying to understand the logic behind everything that had just happened. So your solution was to pretend to be engaged to someone you met 30 seconds earlier. A faint trace of humor appeared in his eyes for the first time. Technically, he said, I never said we were engaged. I held up my hand slightly, so the diamond caught the hallway light again. You put a ring on my finger in front of 80 witnesses, I replied. In most parts of the country that qualifies as a fairly strong suggestion. Lucas glanced at the ring thoughtfully, then back at me. That room needed a new story, he said simply. I could not help it. I laughed softly for the first time that night, the tension that had been coiled inside my chest finally beginning to loosen. You realize people are going to talk about this, I said. Probably by tomorrow morning half of Chicago will believe some mysterious engagement just happened at the Grand Harbor Hotel. Lucas pushed away from the wall and straightened his jacket slightly. People talk every day, he said calmly. Most of the time it does not change anything. Important. I studied him for another moment, still trying to decide whether he was completely serious or simply very good at staying composed. And what happens tomorrow? I asked finally, when everyone starts asking questions. Lucas met my eyes again, the calm confidence returning instantly. Tomorrow, he said quietly, you will wake up without anyone in that ballroom believing you were the woman who got humiliated. He paused for a moment before adding, instead they will remember the woman who walked out wearing the ring. I looked down at the diamond again. For the first time that evening, the reflection in the stone did not remind me of embarrassment. It reminded me of the exact moment the story in that ballroom had changed. I looked at the ring again as Lucas finished speaking, the small diamond catching the soft hallway lights every time I moved my hand. It was strange how quickly the meaning of that ring had changed. 20 minutes earlier it had represented the future I thought I had built with Daniel. Then it had become the symbol of the most humiliating moment of my life. And now, standing in the quiet hallway of the Grand Harbor Hotel beside a man I had only just met, it had somehow transformed into something entirely different. A second chance to walk away with dignity. I exhaled slowly and leaned my shoulder lightly against the wall across from Lucas, trying to steady the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my mind. You realize, I said carefully, that this plan of yours might actually create more complications than it solves. Lucas tilted his head slightly, waiting for me to continue. Daniel is not the type of person who enjoys losing an audience, I explained. Tomorrow he is going to try to fix the story. He will probably tell everyone this was some ridiculous stunt. Lucas listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful but calm. When I finished, he nodded once as if acknowledging the point. He might, Lucas said. But people rarely believe a man who already embarrassed himself in front of 80 witnesses. The quiet certainty in his voice made me pause. Lucas stepped away from the wall and walked a few feet down the hallway toward the large windows overlooking Michigan Avenue. Through the glass, I could see the Chicago skyline glowing against the dark night sky, traffic moving slowly along the street 12 floors below us. He slipped his hands into his pockets and looked out at the city lights for a moment before speaking again. Reputation, he said calmly, is built on the stories people repeat about you. Tonight your story changed. I joined him near the window, following his gaze down toward the city. Cars looked like tiny moving lights from this height, weaving through the late evening traffic. You seem very certain about that, I said. Lucas gave a small shrug. I spend a great deal of time observing how rooms work, he replied. When people witness cruelty, they remember it. But they remember even more clearly the moment someone refuses to accept it. I thought back to the ballroom again. The moment the whispers started. The way the room had shifted after Lucas slid the ring onto my finger. For the first time all evening, the memory did not make my stomach twist with embarrassment. Instead, it felt like watching a scene where the ending had unexpectedly changed. "I still cannot believe you did that," I said quietly. Lucas glanced down at my hand where the diamond reflected the city lights through the glass. "It was a practical solution," he said simply. I laughed softly at that description. "Practical," I repeated. "You and I clearly have very different definitions of that word." Lucas's mouth curved slightly at the corner, not quite a full smile, but close enough that the change softened the sharp lines of his expression. "Perhaps," he admitted. The silence between us settled comfortably for a moment as we both looked out over the glowing city. Then a thought crossed my mind that made me turn toward him again. "There is something else," I said. Lucas raised an eyebrow slightly, inviting the question. "You knew my name before I told you," I said slowly. "You said at the moment you picked up the ring." Lucas studied me for a second, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then he leaned one shoulder casually against the window frame. "The invitation list for that event was not exactly private," he explained. "When I arrived earlier tonight, I happened to notice the names attached to the engagement announcement." I blinked in surprise. "You were there before everything happened?" Lucas nodded once. "For about 10 minutes," he said. "Long enough to see how the evening was unfolding." I stared at him for a moment longer before shaking my head in disbelief. "So you watched the whole thing?" "Yes," Lucas said quietly. I glanced down at the ring again, the diamond still glowing faintly under the hallway lights. Then I looked back up at him. "And you decided to step in?" Lucas met my eyes with the same calm certainty he had carried all night. "Some moments," he said, "deserve a different ending." I stayed by the window for a long moment after Lucas said those words, watching the slow movement of traffic along Michigan Avenue 12 floors below us. The city lights reflected softly across the glass, turning the night skyline into a quiet mosaic of gold and white. My life had been heading in one direction only an hour earlier. I had arrived believing I was about to celebrate the beginning of a marriage. Instead, I was standing in a quiet hotel hallway with a diamond ring on my finger placed there by a man who had calmly walked into the worst moment of my life and rewritten it in front of 80 witnesses. I turned the ring slightly with my thumb, studying how the stone caught the reflections from the city outside. "You said some moments deserve a different ending," I said slowly. Lucas nodded once beside me. "Yes." I glanced toward the ballroom doors behind us. The muffled sound of voices still drifted faintly through the hallway. The party had not ended. It had simply continued without us. "Do you ever wonder what happens after the ending?" I asked quietly. Lucas looked at me with mild curiosity. "What do you mean?" I held up my hand slightly so the diamond caught the light again. "This," I said. "Tonight you changed the story inside that room. Tomorrow people will start asking questions. The newspapers, the blogs, the people who attended the party. Someone will say they saw Lucas Romano put a ring on a woman's finger and walk out with her." Lucas considered that for a moment before answering. "That is very possible." I laughed softly. "You say that like it does not matter." Lucas folded his arms loosely and leaned one shoulder against the window frame again. "Most stories people tell fade after a few days," he said calmly, "unless the people involved decide to continue them." The thought lingered in the air between us for a few seconds. Continue them. I looked back down at the ring again, feeling the weight of the moment more clearly now that the adrenaline of the ballroom confrontation had faded. "Lucas," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something honestly." "Of course." I took a slow breath before continuing. "Did you do all of this just to prove a point?" Lucas met my eyes directly. For the first time that evening, his expression changed in a way that felt slightly more serious than before. "No," he said quietly. The answer surprised me enough that I waited for him to continue. Lucas glanced briefly toward the ballroom doors before returning his attention to me. "I stepped in because no one else did," he explained. "And because sometimes people deserve to see that their worst moment does not have to define the rest of their story." The sincerity in his voice made it difficult to respond immediately. I looked back out at the city lights again, letting the meaning of his words settle slowly. Somewhere down on the street, a taxi horn echoed faintly through the glass. After a moment, I turned back toward him. "So what happens now?" Lucas pushed away from the window and adjusted his jacket again with the same calm precision he had shown all night. "Now," he said, "you go home." I blinked. "That is it." Lucas nodded. "Tonight was about changing one moment," he said. The rest of your story is still yours to decide. I studied him for another second, realizing how unusual it was that he had stepped into my life so dramatically only to give the decision back to me so easily. I looked down at the ring once more. Then slowly I slid it off my finger and held it in my palm. The diamond sparkled quietly under the hallway lights. Lucas watched without interrupting. I stepped forward and placed the ring gently into his hand. You were right about one thing, I said softly. Lucas glanced down at the ring resting in his palm before looking back up at me. What is that? I smiled faintly. That room needed a different ending. For the first time that evening, Lucas actually smiled back. Not the small hint of amusement he had shown earlier, but a genuine smile that softened the sharp lines of his face. Then I suppose, he said, calmly, closing his fingers around the ring. It was worth the interruption. I turned toward the hallway leading to the elevators, feeling lighter than I had when the evening began. As I took the first step away, Lucas's voice stopped me once more. Emily. I looked back over my shoulder. Lucas stood by the window, the city lights behind him. Yes. He held the ring loosely between his fingers and said quietly, if you ever decide that story deserves a second chapter, you know where to find me. For a moment, I considered the possibility. Then I smiled again before stepping toward the elevator doors, leaving the hallway and the rewritten ending of that night behind me.